Thank you, Paul, too, for these last 3 weeks on our series on belonging and adoption. And perhaps you've been coming and going, and you can go online and listen to those messages as Paul gave us a wonderful 3-week series on family, community, our sense of belonging to Christ and with one another. Well, welcome to our summer series, our You Asked For It series, and the goal of this series is to address some topics, some pressing topics that are ruminating and rattling around in your cranium, and we want to see what does the Bible say about some of these issues at hand. And so throughout the summer we'll be addressing a number of issues related to God, related to the Bible, related to morality, related to culture, related to society at large, related to pain. And today we're biting off a big one, and that's the whole creation-evolution debate. Now, depending on the circles you move in, this may not even be a debate because the evolutionary model has been so dramatically embraced that any other notion is deemed as absolute wacko. And so that may be Greek mythology, or worse, creationism. And so it may not be even a debate in some of your circles because in your educational context, your academic context, particularly students and university students, high school students, you're so immersed in this kind of mindset that it's virtually a non-issue. Others of us perhaps just really don't want to think about it. We love our Lord, we love the church, we love ministry, we love doing what we're doing, and we're just a little bit anxious about wading into a conflict, wading into a debate over something that perhaps we don't fully understand or have a lot of information that we can grab a hold of. And so today, I want us to grapple with this issue at least a little bit. I want us to understand the issue just a bit better. I want us to appreciate some of the complexities of this issue. And although I certainly am not a scientist, I want us to reflect with confidence on this debate, because our faith is reasonable. In no way is it incongruent with thoughtful academic thought or scientific inquiry. And we do not have to be ashamed for our position on science as Christians. Now, yes, ours is a faith, and we will never lose sight of the fact that what we embrace is faith, and that's the whole beauty and mystery of the Christian faith that involves that sense of faith. But it's not a silly faith. It's not an unreasonable faith. It's not an implausible faith. And so I'll say that while this is not a normal textual exegetical analysis of a particular passage of Scripture as we normally do, we are going to grapple with something hugely significant that is shaping our world, and something that I hope and I trust will strongly encourage us in our own faith. And so let's dive in. I hope you've got a program because I've given you a fairly full outline. You can make as many notes or as little notes as you want. And I will periodically be referencing some key words. Write the key word down and then do some Google search. Do some research on some of these areas that I touch on. But let's start with defining creation. Okay, let's define it. Creation is the belief, or some might call it a theory, that the origins of all matter, energy, and life find their beginnings with the creative act of God. That is creation. Now, the foundational presupposition is every worldview, every philosophical thought, every mental model, every belief system has presuppositions. Foundational thoughts, values, beliefs that you're going into the subject matter with. And so the foundational presupposition for creationism is that God exists, that there is a God, and that He acts. It's not just that He exists, but that He acts, that He's engaged. And so this presupposition is, if we embrace God, it's a rational basis to the creation model. It's reasonable, it's defendable, it's not provable, but it's defendable. It is a presupposition and an assumption on which our system is built. And so I just want us to be honest about that framework. Okay, let's acknowledge we do have a presupposition. And so all of our discussion about creation presupposes that God exists and that God is engaged. Okay? Now, biblically, creation has a powerful role. Let me just acknowledge at least two demonstrative roles that creation has. First of all, creation reveals God. It tells us about God. If I can turn your attention to Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 20, and what the book of Romans is doing is Romans builds a case for Christianity. And he goes back to creation, then he surveys Israel's history and the formation of faith, the purpose of the law, coming into Christ, and the work of Christ, the work of the Holy Spirit. That's the book of Romans. It's a wonderful foundational book, and if you're looking for some theological reading this summer, spend some time in the book of Romans. But in Romans chapter 1, he says this, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by unrighteousness suppress the truth." So Paul here is specifically talking about sort of essentially human nature, but he's talking about a historic time when people's ungodliness so overcame them that they suppressed the truth. We can suppress truth. The scriptures talk about intuitive ideas, innate ideas, but we can suppress those truths. Okay? So he's talking about people who suppress truth. What truth? Well, the very next verse. "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made." So what Paul here is saying is he's saying, from what we see, human beings are accountable. Just from what we see, human beings are accountable. And if you wanted to tease this out, you'll see that in those 3 verses, you have the seeds of the 4 classic arguments for the existence of God. The moral argument, that's the argument of conscience. The teleological argument, which is the argument of order. We have order in our world. The cosmological argument, which is the argument of causality and causation. We're going to talk a bit about that this morning. As well as the ontological argument, which is a more sophisticated argument about the conception of perfection. Okay? So in those 3 verses, we have embedded and implanted the 4 classical defenses for the existence of God. So creation reveals God. It tells us something about God. And secondly, creation does something else. Creation glorifies God. Listen to what Psalm 19 says. "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." The heavens declare the glory of God. And so when you see creation, whether it's under a microscope or whether it's in the vastness of the image before you, it glorifies God. And so just 3 weeks ago, I was in the mountains of British Columbia, and I was again confronted by the majesty and by the splendor and by the boldness and by the strength and by the seemingly agelessness and by the confidence-inspiring mountains. They're there, and you're just overwhelmed by these mountains. But you know what the thought did? It didn't cause me to stay with the mountains. It caused me to go beyond the mountains, behind the mountains, to the one who created the mountains. And so when you really drink in the complexities and the splendor and the beauty of creation, whether it's the complexities of a cell or whether it's the oceans or the mountains or the sky, whatever, it declares God. If we but have the eyes to see them and the thoughtfulness to reflect upon it. And so creation is powerful, and back to Romans, holds us accountable. So creation has a powerful role. It reveals God, and it glorifies God. Okay? Now, this matter of evolution, let me define it before we wade into this discussion. Evolution, this is defining evolution. This is the belief or theory that all living things have come to their present state of being through a series of steps or mutations in which life has gradually become more complex. Now, for most naturalists and evolutionists, their foundational presupposition, okay, they're walking into it with a presupposition as well. Do not be deceived, do not be naive. We all have presuppositions. Their presupposition is this: matter, energy, and life will be explained in natural terms. In other words, we're going to explain everything we see without God. And so the foundational presupposition, or really the foundational goal, is how can we explain reality without God? Now, there are some theistic evolutionists who believe in God, but essentially, the evolutionary model as a well-embraced, understood model is an attempt to explain the natural world without God. No God. And so we need to appreciate that this is a big issue. Now, let me explain why this is a watershed issue. Because we may be tempted to just set this aside and we slice our life into pies, and that's just an academic question that we don't want to address. But let me just highlight why this is a watershed issue for Christians. Why this is a watershed issue for thoughtful believers. Okay? And let me identify a number of them. First of all, our view on creation, it will affect our anthropology. See, Genesis 1 tells us that we've been made in the image of God. And as we read through the scriptures, as we develop an anthropology, a view of human beings, the Bible says we have a soul, and that we're made in the image of God, that we're like God, that we are different from all other expressions of creation, that we are unique, that we are special, and that we have a particular value in God's eyes. Now, if we do not have the creation of human beings, and if you do not have a soul, and if we're not made in the image of God, then we are just a superior life form, an animal, a mammal, that has evolved with no soul. And so it affects how you view the person. Okay? Now, and all these are cascading. The second implication is this affects our morality and our ethics. Absolutely it does. Because if there is no God, and we have no soul, and there's no distinct value to human beings, if we are just a higher, more sophisticated form of animal, then all of our constructs of morality are moot. And so whether it's the more dramatic ones of murder and abuse or theft, or whether it's abortion, or whether it's euthanasia, or whether it's infanticide, or whether it's dishonesty, or whatever ethical values you have, all those become moot because there's no God to whom we will give account. And if there's no God to whom we will give account, it's a moot issue. And so Nietzsche's whole presupposition and his whole value system, which was evolutionary in premise, is that the strong survive and the weak die. That's the only real enduring observation about any sort of moral purpose. And we know Nietzsche impacted the formation of a whole ideology of the Nazis. And so it affects our morality and our ethics. If there's no God, and we aren't unique, then we can just jettison morality. Thirdly, it affects our sense of purpose and meaning and destiny. Existentialism, you can do some more work on this. Existentialism basically says life is meaningless, life is purposeless, life is empty. And so if there's any hope to any sort of purpose, create it for yourself. Find it, create it, engineer it, imagine it, whatever. And don't let anyone give moral evaluation to it. You just do whatever you want to do. That will give you purpose, because there is no purpose. However, if we're theistic, if we believe in God, then suddenly we have someone to inform our sense of purpose and destiny in life. There's something bigger out there. So, this is a watershed issue. It affects our view of purpose. It also affects our theology, because you see, the Bible teaches creation. And if we embrace evolution, then suddenly is God just playing with us? Jesus referred to a historic Adam. The Apostle Paul referred to a historic Adam. And if Adam was not an historic figure, then we have no historic fall. If we have no historic fall, we have no depravity of the human condition. And we have no need for a redemptive Savior. Everything is hinged on that. Everything unfolds because of that, and the dominoes begin to fall. And so it affects our theology as well. It affects our view of the Bible. Is this just a story full of myths, or is this a historic treatment and a revelation of God and of the purposes of God, the heart of God, and the character of God? And so it affects our theology. And finally, this affects our daily living. It really does. It affects the way you know live, because at the core is a huge question. Here it is. Are we accountable to God? Okay? Are we accountable to God? And if we aren't accountable to God, then what does it matter? But if we are accountable to God, then we live life with sobriety and with a sense of thoughtfulness and with a sense of purpose and a sense of giving serious reflection to our relationship with God. And that takes us into the whole implications of the gospel. And so this really affects our daily living. But if we're not accountable to God, then we are wasting our time here this morning. Then go live, do whatever you want to do, because there's no God to whom we give account, there's no moral structures or boundaries, and these are the logical implications. So care for the poor, the weak, all jettisoned, because let the strong survive, let the weak die. So this is a watershed issue. Absolutely so. So let me identify a handful of pivotal issues. And let me just say, I'm just barely touching the veneer of all of these. And for those of you who are more scientifically inclined, please forgive my clumsiness and my oversimplification, truly so. And for those of you who perhaps are not remotely scientifically inclined, forgive me if some of these concepts are a struggle. Please feel free to do some further investigation on them. I just also want to say I researched a number of different sources. I'll reference a few of them. I found J.P. Moreland particularly helpful in this, but I'm not going to be referencing every bit of data. But this data is certainly accessible. So let me talk about some pivotal issues. First of all, there's the issue of scientific models. Okay, there's the issue of scientific models. What do we mean by that? Well, operational science or operation science basically is an exploration of how things normally work. Okay, this is pivotal. How things normally work. It examines how the world normally works in its present expression. It studies things that happen over and over again with regularity. And so the key to scientific experimentation and scientific investigation is repeatability. Can we repeat this experiment over and over and over and over and over again? And if we can repeat it numerous times, after 100 times, then we can make some very calculated observations as to how we think it's going to happen in the future. Because we've repeated the experiment over and over. And we've looked at present normalities. Okay? Ongoing things. How do things work? And scientific inquiry is based on, can we repeat this? Can we do this test over again? Origin science, and I'm not just making up a word here. Origin science is a completely different kind of science, because in origin science we're trying to study past singularities. And with past singularities, you can't reproduce it. And so this is a poor example, but if you're watching one of the episodes of the many CSIs, and you're watching how in 42 minutes a forensic scientist, forensic investigator solves a grisly murder. And so they will gather data and information to help inform a model, to help inform an opinion as to what happened. But you can't repeat that past singularity. It was a past singular event. And so operation science looks at things the way they normally work, and we repeat it. Okay? With creation, you can't repeat it. And so evolution has posited a model for interpreting that past singularity, and it's presenting theories and models for how that past singularity might have taken place in their idea, in their mind. But you need to know that it can't be repeated. It doesn't fall under the boundaries of operation science. Further, it's curious how we've had different models throughout time and history. Let me just illustrate something. We used to think that there was a big dome over the earth. There's a big dome over, not we as a society, people, there's a dome over the earth, and there are windows in which light shine through, and the stars. Okay? And then we thought that the earth was the center of the universe, and everything else pivoted around us, because we were the climax, we were the apex, we were the center of all. And then we thought, well, the sun is the center of the universe, and we all, but then we are now just one of a multiplicity of galaxies. And so models change as we develop, and as we speculate, and as we learn, and as we grow. And so the present model that's being speculated upon is origin science, and you can't repeat it. So I'm not saying as creationists, as from a biblical worldview, that we shouldn't be exploring scientific questions about it, but we need to acknowledge there will always be a sense of mystery, and there is always a sense in which it cannot be repeated. So it falls under a whole different category in and of itself. Secondly, there's the issue of causality and order. The basic question here is, what is the cause of any given effect? You see, something does not come from nothing. Right? If you got something, something comes from something. Something doesn't come from nothing. And so evolution seeks to explain, for example, the development of life as for more simple chemical generations and reactions. But what about the originating cause? Evolution does not address the ultimate cause. And when the dominoes fall, what was the first catalyst to the fall of those dominoes? What started it? And so, from a theistic point of view, theism is just a belief in God. From a theistic point of view or from a Christian point of view, we would say God is the first cause. In fact, the definition, God is the first cause of all causes, yet himself uncaused. Because he's eternal. God is eternal. And so the issue of causality from a Christian point of view, it begins with God, the eternal cause, the prime mover, the first mover. But from a material, naturalistic perspective, or from an evolutionary perspective, the whole issue, what was the first cause? Evolution does not answer that one adequately. Then you add to this the issue of order. Now, earlier, and for centuries, this used to be referenced as a teleological argument for the existence of God, really. And the teleological argument basically is often called the watchmaker theory. And basically, if you find a watch in the desert, you assume what? A watchmaker. This teleological argument has been further developed, and so there's a view or a principle called the anthropic principle. And the anthropic principle basically says that because there's so much complexity, the last couple of decades, the complexity and orderliness of even the most, let alone the universe, life, but even the single cell, there's so much information and data to understand how one single cell works. It would consume the equivalent volumes of encyclopedia information. Okay, so the amount of data to understand a cell, and so with the anthropic principle, it looks at all these various examples, whether it's gravity or electromagnetism, or it looks at all these different categories, things that work in the universe. And there's such dramatic orderliness to it all. And so John Leslie, in his book Universes, he identifies all kinds of examples of this perfect order. And so even to something as simple as life, which we're so vital to. In fact, this goes back to the 19th century when some scientists were musing on the complexities of water because of the unique properties of the hydrogen atom. See, think about it. Water in its solid form is lighter than it is in its liquid form. If it was the exact opposite, the oceans would freeze from the bottom up, and we would live in igloos. Everything would be so different. And so they look at all these kinds of examples in the universe, and the complexity and the orderliness begs a designer. It begs something more. The complexity and orderliness begs something more. Fred Hoyle, who is an evolutionist, transitioned in his thinking, as far as I know, not to faith, but he transitioned in some of his evolutionary thinking as time went on. I believe he's dead now. He's passed away. But he was the originator of the phrase Big Bang Theory. And he abandoned this because of his increasing investigation into the orderliness of the world. Hoyle, who first coined the term Big Bang, questioned the legitimacy of his original metaphor. And he said this, as an evolutionist, he said this: an explosion in a junkyard does not lead to sundry bits of metal being assembled into a useful working machine. That sounds like something a Christian might say, but this is something an evolutionist said, perplexed at the level of orderliness and complexity at so many levels. And so if you're really interested in this, pick up Universes by John Leslie, or at least read through it, and be overwhelmed. at all the levels of wow, the balances are so nuanced, they're so perfect. So, third issue, the issue of the origin of the universe and the second law of thermodynamics. There are two views of origins. Either things came into being through natural causes, or they came into being through supernatural causes, which is our presupposition. In the case of the origins of the universe, it either had a beginning or it didn't. Okay? Our presupposition is that the universe that we see had a beginning. Now, what happens is the second law of thermodynamics is an argument for the beginnings. That matter, the natural order that we see, had a beginning. Now, basically the second law of thermodynamics says this, that there's a limited amount of usable energy, and it is decreasing in nature. The amount of usable energy is decreasing, and so more popularly or more quickly we illustrate that the law of second law of thermodynamics is that things are winding down. Things don't grow in complexity; they reduce in complexity. They break. They wear out. They rust out. They wear down. And so the second law of thermodynamics is basically saying that things are breaking down because there's a limited amount of usable energy and it's descending. That reality, that observable reality, that defensible model or theory suggests that the material world is finite, that it was not eternal, and that it had a beginning. So you can see how these all connected. It goes, what was the first cause? What was the catalyst? What started the natural order? There has to be something or someone behind it. So the second law of thermodynamics says everything's wearing down, and we're not going to explore this very much this morning, but the fact that things are unwinding, it also goes against the presupposition of evolution that things are increasing in complexity, whereas the second law of thermodynamics says that it's decreasing. It's breaking down. It's not improving. It's not evolving. It's devolving. Fourth, the issue of the origins of life and new life forms. Okay, here's another pivotal issue. Again, these don't prove creation, but they certainly undermine or help us to see that the evolutionary model has some serious issues, making creationism plausible, certainly with our presupposition that God exists and that God acts. Here's another one. The issue of the origins of life and all life forms, or new life forms. Evolution posits that life began through natural causes. Creation posits that life began through supernatural causes. Evolution says there was no intelligent intervention. Creation assumes or says there was intelligent intervention. Evolution says that life began with a spontaneous chemical generations, a combination of simple gases, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, all reacting to create amino acids. Ammonia, carbon dioxide, and all to create amino acids. And eventually they develop into DNA chains, which eventually developed into cells and life forms. Okay, that's the presupposition. Creation says there was a creator. Now, experimentation on this, okay? Experimentation by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey to construct the conditions to have life take place have brought to the point of creating amino acids, okay? They brought all these chemicals to the creation of amino acids, but that's as far as they've gotten. They've not been able to create the conditions which cause amino acids to then turn into life or into cell structures. That simply has not, and that's a foundational underpinning to evolution that has not taken place. Now, there are some problems with this model. The conditions necessary for the creation of these amino acids, and for those amino acids to be the foundation to life, requires that there's no oxygen. There's oxygen on the earth. Even from an evolutionary perspective in time, that there was oxygen on the earth. Okay? That inhibits, that will limit or prohibit life from being created. Furthermore, the geological record does not defend this. And also, and here's the most obvious one, the very experimentation that's going on is implying what? Intelligent design. Who's playing with all these chemicals? Intelligent design. People. We are. And so, even if we were able to create something out of those amino acids, it still has behind it not disorderliness, not randomness, but intelligent design. You may question our level of intelligence, but nevertheless, there's some level of intelligent design behind it. So the whole experimentation is flawed in its model, in its understanding. Now, biologists Paul and Ann Ulrich have observed that, listen to this, as this relates to new life forms. The production of new animal species has yet to be documented. Okay? So, we have not proved that life can be created naturally, nor do we have evidence of the eruption or the entrance of new life forms, even from those early expressions of life form. There's no evidence for this. Nada. There's no concrete evidence for the creation of new life forms, even if we could prove the creation of life naturally. There's no evidence of new life forms. I'm going to come back to that when I talk about the fossil records. Here's a fifth issue. The issue of the prebiotic soup, where the amino acids created life. As mentioned in the evolutionary model, there was this prebiotic soup where there's hydrogen, nitrogen, ammonia, carbon dioxide, all these things generating together. Again, the geological evidence does not speak to these prebiotic soups, nor do they speak to the conditions necessary for the creation of amino acids leading to life, because of the existence of oxygen. So that is a significant scientific issue that the evolutionary model has not been able to navigate through. However, the evolution of life is also contrary to the second law of thermodynamics, where things are unwinding, not increasing in complexity. And so, if you were to take the possibility of life being created randomly, it would be 1 times 10 to the power of 40,000. So it's not just 1 in 40,000, but 1 times 10, times 10, times 10, times 10, times 10, 40,000. And that kind of dramatic probability or improbability just renders the whole model as so extremely and so highly improbable and implausible. So, again, the likelihood of this happening, the probability of this happening, would be akin to blowing up a machine shop and ending up with a Boeing 747. That's the level of complexity. And as sarcastic as that may sound, again, I take you to the complexity of just the human cell. Its level of complexity is so grand that you could liken it to the building of a Boeing 747. A couple more issues. The issue of the fossil records. I've referenced that very briefly. But in actuality, the fossil records support creationism. The fossil records do not support evolutionary model, because the evolutionary model would posit that the fossil records that we have, regardless of your timeline or what kind of chronology or age measurement you're using, the fossil records from an evolutionary model would predict that we would have all kinds of transitional life forms, which we don't have. We just don't have. So we have all kinds of common life forms. We have all kinds of life forms which reflect familial relationship, but we don't have transitioning fossils. And this is the whole proverbial link. We don't have evidence to show that life transitioned from one expression to another. The fossil records do not bear this out. There are no links between one kind of life form and a higher expression of life or higher level of complexity. They just do not exist. And so we've got all marine invertebrates, all fully formed, and then we've got there's all kinds of life forms in a common strand, but not transitioning to a more complex strand. So again, the The curious thing is the fossil records actually defend creationism. I just mention one more issue with evolution, a serious issue with evolution, and that is the extrapolation from micro to macro evolution. Microevolution, micro meaning small, microevolution is observable. Don't get all bent out of shape. It's observable. It's a reality. But macroevolution, the development or transition from one species to another species, that has not been proved. And so we may have evidence of microevolution whereby a moth might adapt itself so that it can camouflage itself with black in a dark environment, but it's still a moth. And so we have evidence of microevolution, of minor adaptation within species. We have no evidence of one species transitioning into another kind of species. It simply does not exist. There is no evidence. There's a model, there's a theory for it, but there's no evidence for it. Now I want you to listen to this quote. This is Michael Denton, a respected scientist, a biochemist, an author. He's a pretty smart guy. And I want you to listen to what he says. The overriding supremacy of, and he uses the word, the myth of Darwinian evolution has created a widespread illusion that the theory of evolution was all but proved 100 years ago, and that all subsequent biological research, paleontological, zoological, and the newer branches of genetics and molecular biology, has proved ever-increasing evidence for Darwinian ideas. He says, nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is that the evidence was so patchy 100 years ago that even Darwin himself had increasing doubts as to the validity of his views. And the only aspect of his theory which has received any support over the past century is where it applies to microevolutionary phenomena. That's minor adaptation within species. Okay? His general theory that all life on Earth had originated and evolved by a gradual successive accumulation of fortuitous mutations is still, as it was in Darwin's time, a highly speculative hypothesis entirely without direct factual support and very far from the self-evident axiom that some of the more aggressive advocates would have us to believe. In other words, he says, we have done, collectively, societally, we've done a great job of making evolutionary a slam-dunk proved model. And he says, as a scientist, nothing could be further from the truth. So what is the point of this morning? What is the takeaway? And that is that evolution is a theory. It's a highly flawed theory with limited evidence to its model. And though widely embraced, we can accept and own that it has issues. Creationism is entirely reasonable. If you believe in God, then the thought that he acts is certainly not implausible. Why would he not act? And so, suddenly this book becomes a book which tells a story about God who spoke, and it was so, and it was good. And then the story unfolds with human beings, the pinnacle of his creation, made in his image, so that he could have a friendship with us. That was his heart. That was his goal. Human beings with whom he could have a friendship, a relationship. And we messed it all up. And so as the story unfolds, he goes after us. Because he created us. And we're his collective human children. But he wants to adopt us to become his personal children. And so he sends us a son. That takes faith. It's not silly faith. It's a reasonable faith. And the mission of this church is to help you and anybody we can come in contact to discover this wonderful, wonderful story that God wants to have a friendship with us through his son Jesus. And there's nothing to be ashamed about that. We don't have to be embarrassed about believing in the God of the Bible, and a God who acts, and a God who creates, and a God who recreates, because he says when we come into a relationship with him, he makes us his new creation.